Gentlemen, you are both drunk on cosmic wine.
Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Mark Sylvester.
And I'm Dr. Richard Schallman. This is Alt Psych.
We're officially live on tape now, so.
Uh-oh.
Welcome to the
No more swearing.
Nope. We got to cut that shit out. Stuff out. Well, welcome to the virtual landscape that is the post-apocalyptic hellscape known as 2022. I'm honored and privileged to present you Dr. John Lieurance, author of this here, shameless plug, Melatonin, Miracle Molecule Beyond Sleep. You've been doing natural health for a long time, started off as a chiropractor and went back and became a naturopath. What I'm really amazed by is how you've branched out and the amount of knowledge you've gained over 27 years of experience there at Advanced Rejuvenation. You got a terrific website, very informative. I'm going to attach it below, of course. That's ultimatecellularreset.com, which has a lot of frequency, but also a tremendous amount of resource tools on health and wellness. Many podcasts. We were talking about that before, geared to all different levels of knowledge, some above my head, some that's really for the entry level person. But we're going to specifically focus on melatonin today. And I want to thank you for squeezing me in. We've both been crazy busy lately. So every second, every minute counts. So welcome to our little corner of the cyber web.
Well, Dr. Mark, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, and I'm excited to learn about melatonin. You know, I think there was a time where I was like most people, the average schmo. They certainly don't teach anything useful in medical school on this topic. And I, like most people, heard of melatonin, associated it with sleep, thought maybe I knew about the pineal gland because my father was a physician, and maybe I knew a little bit more. But you've changed that. My own studies have changed that. There was a virus that came out 3 years ago that really changed that. The frontline protocol included melatonin, and it's just been an explosion of interest on my part and fascination, not only with this neurohormone, because it's not a drug, it's not a supplement. It's obviously ancient. It's evolved with us and all of our ancestors and creatures back probably since the beginning of time, since it follows the circadian rhythm of the day and night. And then it became particularly interesting because of its role in the pineal gland, which we'll get into as well, where there's a lot of very fascinating molecules like dimethyltryptamine and other things that I've always been interested in as they relate to near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. What I'm really wondering is, let me back up. I think one thing that makes us uniquely qualified in this arena is that we both have gone through our own health challenges in the past, which kind of put us in the patient's seat in a lot of ways to recognize the limitations of not only our own healthcare system, but the Western model firsthand and how it fell short, how it failed to help and heal us. And I kind of feel a unique bond and kinship with you in that I know that you can relate to that because you're not a healthcare provider that just is done the grape juice thing and is a professional technician in doing what that Western model does, but you're also not a patient without a background in physiology and neuroscience. So I think it makes you uniquely compassionate and understanding of that position that a lot of our patients come to us in.
For sure.
You know, and I didn't hear that played up enough in some of in the research for the show. And I think that's a very important point in terms of what drives you, what heals you, what sustains you, what motivates you, why you're so passionate about this. And
Well, there are a lot of healthcare providers that, I've met through my journey that share a pain to purpose story, where you're the broken doctor, right? And then you go out and you have the hero's journey to figure out the problem, and then you have the solution. You go to for contribution to your, fellow humankind to help them navigate a similar challenge. What I got so blessed with, Mark, was I got to be shown virtually the secret to healing with almost any situation. And when you start to appreciate the fact that the body is a self-healing, self-regulating machine, it's got wisdom that, as you mentioned, includes things like the molecule melatonin and different systems that are ancient. I mean, they're likely, even billions of years. I mean, we really don't know. I mean, maybe some of these things came in asteroids, and I mean, there's just a lot of unknowns. But life would not be possible without melatonin, and melatonin truly is a miracle molecule, and it sits right in the middle of the most action in the cell that there is, which is where the rubber meets the road, where the cell is making energy. And this is what breaks down with almost every disease as a response to stress, which always includes an inflammatory reaction from the stressor that really is at the core of that effect.
Yeah, I've heard you say similar things in a number of ways, and it's so we were talking about kind of cracking the secret and again, it's not controlling our biology, it's understanding, appreciating, respecting, and helping course correct the innate wisdom of the body. Like I've heard you say many times before, and I just think that's so spot on. That resonates with me. It's quite brilliant, and I think it's the true heart of healing. So much of the Western model is treat the symptom, kick the can down the curb. Oh, there's nothing more we can do. That doesn't exist because I don't know about it. And people are waking up. People don't buy that jive anymore. And we've seen a huge increase in patients getting disillusioned with the system and looking for more complementary and alternative means. I don't think of what we do as complementary and alternative. I think of it as closer to the actual heart of what Hippocrates was ultimately trying to do. It wasn't trying to create big pharma. He wasn't trying to do politics. He wasn't trying to know better than Mother Nature. I mean, the actual spirit of the Hippocratic Oath is, hey, we're passing on the wisdom that we've learned up until this point, but you need to take it further, and you need to be appreciative for all that we know, but you need to be ready to abandon what doesn't work too.
Well, it's like you're looking at the industrialization of healthcare and the democracy, right? It's like you have capitalism, and capitalism works except for one thing that needs to be in place, is that people are going to play fair in the sandbox, right?
Yep.
And that's that is the problem, is that what's happened is when you have the incentive of money, it doesn't always match what's best for humankind and healthcare. And I can give you hundreds and hundreds of examples, but if you look at just like gut health, right? Like if you're a medical doctor and you're in or even a DO, unfortunately DOs used to be a lot more holistic, and they kind of sold out. But if you're in medical school, the books that you're reading are literally sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry, which means that what the doctors are literally learning is the narrative that big pharma wants them to hear, such as like, if you have acid reflux, that you block that symptom, which is a symptom of something that's an underlying dis-ease, a lack of ease in the body. And then the body is having a symptom, and we're going to treat that symptom with something that's going to block the acid. And if you look at all of the research, it all points to the same thing, that virtually all heartburn is caused by an infection of H. pylori. And this is something that isn't commonly even looked at and tested. It's just blindly. And so this is what the doctors are learning in medical school. They're not learning about the physiology of how the gut works, the physiology of chewing, the aspect of how the stomach acid is a natural and important reaction for food in the stomach, and that the pH actually has to get all the way down to a 2 to trigger the pyloric sphincter to release and let those contents into the small intestines, which then produces this bicarbonate dump from the pancreas. And so this is like this symphony that's happening, and we think that we're going to mess with nature and just block the acid, when that acid is doing two very important things. One is it's breaking down proteins to make them available for us to absorb, but it's also ionizing minerals to make them available for us to absorb. So when people go on these acid blockers for long periods of time, and by the way, the pharmaceutical companies put it in their literature that it's just for short term, but that's not the way that they've inspired the medical community to utilize that. But this is just one little aspect that when you step back and you really look at that, it's not what is best for an individual that has that condition.
Well, your point about the medical training, I couldn't agree with more. I noticed many people know I was an engineer before a doctor, and one thing engineers are phenomenally bad at is memorization, is accepting information at face value. So I struggled quite honestly in medical school for two major reasons. One, I won't just memorize and regurgitate because I have to understand. I have to get the big picture. And two, I was usually in the front row, why? And I realized not only did none of my classmates want me to ask why ever, they got annoyed with it, as did the professors, because they don't ever ask why. Like, to your point about the stomach acid, why is stomach acid there? That's really the ultimate question. Is it there by accident? Is it a dysfunction? No, stomach acid is a normal function. It's supposed to be there. And, you touched on a couple points, mineral absorption and all that. It does way more than that as well. It changes the dysbiosis it can cause. It can certainly
the dysbiosis is if the stomach acid's not strong enough, there's not a strong enough stimuli to the pancreas to dump that bicarb. So the end result is an acidic substance. So all those stomach blockers are, those acid blockers are literally creating a more acid substance in the small intestines, which then leads to leaky gut and dysbiosis. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Good point.
Yeah. And so when I approached medicine, and I still to this day, I can't undo the way I'm wired. It's always that function in the physiology. That's why I've always admired DOs, because they tend to think more about that. I really admire naturopaths because almost all of them think that way. And to me, to not think that way and be in medicine doesn't compute for my brain. So when I realized there were two other engineers in my class of 225, both of those guys suffered similarly, and we would have to explain things to each other because we'd have to try to figure out what we weren't being taught, understand the why, and then bring that information. But many of the topics they just don't know enough to ask about. Melatonin is a perfect example.
Yeah.
We were talking about the GI system. What exactly does melatonin have to do with the GI system? Because most people think of, it's a sleep hormone.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move into some really good applications. I mean, I think anybody listening to this show, my goal is to give you some really good information that you can take away from this show and use practically in your life to create more vitality. And physical vitality is one of our three pillars and to ultimate health. And so taking melatonin, especially after the age of 40, makes a lot of sense. And just, to your point with gut health, who would think that melatonin would actually have that application for gut health? But actually, there's an entire chapter in the book, and there's something called microbiome swarming. So it just so happens that the gut it has a circadian rhythm, the microbiome has a circadian rhythm. And so when they're triggered by melatonin, which is released by the cells that line the gut, which is 400 times more melatonin than what the pineal releases, by the way, that's a lot, right? 400x. And so all this melatonin dumps into the gut, and those good bacteria thrive with this melatonin and start to reproduce, and it's called swarming, and that they do that at night with the melatonin, just like when you're sleeping. The other thing that's really amazing is that some of the bad bacteria that can cause colitis and Crohn's disease, and a lot of ulcerative colitis, are suppressed when they looked at the studies with this. And so I think anybody with any type of a gut condition should take a close look at, their sleep. I mean, every single person with a gut problem, I guarantee you're going to look at, there's some problems with their sleep and their melatonin release, because they're so hardwired.
Yeah, and you made the analogy of kind of like a bee swarm in the book, which you make a lot of analogies that resonate with me, because one, I thought I invented these analogies, and then I hear you say them, and I'm like, wow, he thinks the same way I do.
Like kicking the beehive.
Yeah, kicking the beehive, or you had a really good one. Oh, about traffic flow. You remember making that analogy? I use that one all the time, and I thought I came up with that, and it's brilliant. I use it when we're talking about heavy metal detox, and kind of this car breaks down, not really a big deal. You see the occasional car on the side of the highway, they slap a sticker on it. It may stay there forever. It may get towed off in a couple days. Not a big deal. Nobody's rubbernecking. It's not obstructing. But you play that tape out, and you get more and more cars breaking down, and now some of them are in the middle lane, and some are on fire, and the tow trucks can't keep up.
These are senescent cells you're referencing, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's such, I think, an analogy and metaphor, so that resonates very well with me. I want to talk a little bit about the other effects besides the gut. I wanted to specifically, because there's literally too much to cover all of the biologic functions melatonin does. But I'm trying to pick on ones that, like you said, might be the most practical for the viewer, or an area that we've touched on less in this particular podcast, such as cancer, such as heavy metal detox.
Yeah.
And then, we get into the pineal gland specifically, and fluoride and DMT and detoxing and all of that. But what is melatonin's role in cancer in terms of prevention and treatment?
Well, when you understand, if you look at something called the Warburg effect, which is highly referenced in all cancer research, because the Warburg effect is when the mitochondria stops producing energy, and the energy is moved out of the mitochondria into the cell structure. And it's a big hit for the cell. I mean, the cell all of a sudden is at like 10% capacity to make energy. And oftentimes this hit occurs when we have a fairly stressful situation that the body's attempting to adapt to, right? So you can imagine like an infection like COVID. An individual has this inflammatory reaction from the infection, and the trigger with the Warburg effect is too much inflammation, which is too much stress, because all stressors are going to have that one thing in common, where they're leading to an inflammatory response and a certain set of cytokines. And the mitochondria really don't like, they don't like swimming in that stuff. They basically say, the water's a little bit too dirty, I'll come back to the beach, when red tide's gone, something like that, right? There's an analogy for you. We're in Sarasota. We get red tide over on this coast.
I'm familiar with that.
And so it'd be the same thing. If I was a mitochondria and it was like too much red tide, I'm like, hey, this is bothering my respiratory, I'm just going to come back. And
Yeah, I'm
you
not
guys-
going to go paddleboarding today.
Yeah. So, so then what's left for the cell is to go to a very primitive form of energy, which is called fermentation or anaerobic glycolysis, where you're making energy without oxygen. And, and so it's primitive because at some point in the evolution or creation of the human cell, there was a symbiotic relationship where the mitochondria then entered the cell, and the cell then and the mitochondria have this relationship where the mitochondria is able to make the energy much more efficient, and the mitochondria can exist inside of the cell, and they're like this happy relationship, right? So we're going back to the primitive way of making energy, meaning before this upgrade happened to the cell. And so if we were fighting an infection and all of a sudden we have this Warburg effect, we're all of a sudden faced with a battle that we only have 10% of the troops left to fight. And so we're surely going to begin to lose that. It doesn't necessarily mean for sure that that battle is going to be lost, but it's a high probability. And we call that the cytokine storm. And this happens with COVID. This happens with virtually every infection. But what people aren't talking about is that this is happening with all diseases. And this is at the root of literally all diseases to some extent.
100%.
Because if we can adapt to something, right? So you kind of have these two choices. If you're sick, either the body can adapt or you die, right? I mean, what other options are there, right? So there's an adaptation, because there's never going to be something that comes in and heals you, right? I mean, we don't, as physicians, we don't heal anybody. The body does the healing. All we do is remove the interference, and provide some support. But the healing happens by the body at the cellular level, and it needs energy to do that. It needs energy to create this adaptation. And so when the body runs out of energy, the adaptive capacity of the body is reduced, and then disease will manifest in your body depending on your genetics, your epigenetics. And it doesn't get any simpler than that.
And it's sad and frustrating that Western medicine doesn't get that very basic concept. I couldn't agree with you more. It starts from the training. You hear about from bench to bedside. That sounds like a cool catchphrase, but how many people are in between bench and bedside? And who's paying for these studies in the bench is a big problem. But for that information to get to the physicians, it has been managed, manipulated, and certainly tainted in a way.
There's middlemen. It doesn't go straight from the bench anymore.
Yeah.
There's all these middlemen with their hands out, and the FDA is making sure that continues that way. But yeah. So listen, there's a silver lining to this. And the silver lining is that when this system was set up with this symbiotic relationship, melatonin was there. And melatonin, I would almost say, was the friendly molecule that kind of chaperoned. I can just see a melatonin molecule taking a mitochondria into the cell, and hey, we're going to go do this together. Like, let's go on this adventure. I think we can really upgrade these cells, because I'm going to sit here and I'm going to keep things from getting a little bit too hot. So I can let you really work and make a bunch of oxygen. A lot of ATP with glucose and oxygen. And we're going to churn out close to 10 times the amount of energy that the cell can make right now. And I'm going to stay here with you as long as things don't get too crazy. Now, if the red tide comes in, though, I'm out of here, right?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to do it yourself. And so that's kind of how I visualize that whole scenario. Now, what's really amazing is that you can take melatonin, and it can reverse this process, and it can also prevent this process from even flipping out of the mitochondria to begin with. And they've done lots and lots of studies. And this is the reason that it seems to work on such a wide variety of conditions. And when you look at the Melatonin Miracle Molecule book, you just see there's a chapter on cardiovascular, neurology, skin, gut. There's a chapter on, musculoskeletal, inflammation, infection, sleep. It's
Sex
all
hormones,
there.
autoimmune,
Yeah, hormones, glands,
diabetes, cancer,
diabetes,
liver. It's such a great book. The way it's, I mean, I review a lot of books. I read a lot of books. This has honestly been one of my biggest pearls and gems that I've run across, not only as a human, but as a provider, because it's information that I've kind of picked out from all over, all put into one authoritative, I highly agree, accurate resource that you could just get right off Amazon and empower yourself. I mean, of course, work with your primary provider. We're not disseminating that medical information, but we're appreciating the role that it has. And melatonin's arguably the most ancient part of our brain.
Well, the sad thing is, if people are going to turn to their provider regarding melatonin, what they're going to hear is, oh no, that's dangerous. It can be toxic, and it'll shut down your own production. And then you're going to be reliant on taking it the rest of your life. These things are completely false. The word toxic and melatonin shouldn't even be used in the same sentence. And, there's been a article that's been floating around about 5 children, and they say that there's toxic exposure to these kids from melatonin, and we need to be really careful. And what's interesting was you really look under the covers with this and dig into it, you find that the kids had a very wide range of doses, from like 15 milligrams up to, I think, 40 or so. And so there's no consistency on dosing, and there was also no control over what else was going on. And so it's very probable that you just had these accidental things that happened, and they just happened to be kids that were on melatonin. And people are thinking, well, kids shouldn't be on melatonin, blah, blah, blah. But that's ridiculous, because kids make a lot of melatonin. And so melatonin has been shown to be so non-toxic that when they did it with animal studies, they had to stop at about 150,000 milligrams. That would be about the correlation, would be an adult taking about 150,000 milligrams. And they stopped at saying, we just don't see any toxicity. So there's no toxicity with melatonin. So those two words shouldn't be in the same sentence. And secondly, what's really beautiful about melatonin is that you don't shut down your own production when you take it as a supplement. And so when you take melatonin as a supplement, you have a couple of options. You've got taking it orally in a pill. There's liposomal versions, which are better because they're going to get a little bit better absorption into the system in those liposomes. And then you have a suppository route of delivery, which happens to be the best because it mimics the absorption into the system. And that oral melatonin has been shown to only be about a 1.5% absorbable. And so when you're getting into liposomals, there's going to be a higher absorption there, but it's just very poorly absorbed in pills. So that's not the best way to consume melatonin. Now, you skip all of the problems with oral schedules with things like melatonin and a lot of other nutrients when you do it with a suppository, because you're not breaking it down with the stomach acid and the digestive enzymes. And there's something called first pass through the liver, which breaks a lot of these things down, and you're skipping all that. So you're getting this slow bleed directly into the bloodstream over the course of 5 to 7 hours. And this works really well. And another molecule I'm really excited about is glutathione, because it's also a sleep promoting substance. It's got great antioxidant capacities. And so this is something that we put into a suppository and a liposomal product called Sandman.
Yeah, the Sandman is the 200 milligram dose, and then you even have the Super Sandman at the 400 milligrams. And the suppository, for you to come up with the suppository just shows how you're understanding the physiology, you're understanding the way that the body absorbs, processes, you know, the homeostasis, let's say, mechanisms of melatonin, and then the way that it works, you know, what melatonin actually does at the mitochondria, at the cellular level. It's far superior. And even if there wasn't an absorption problem, oral absorption problem, there's still the time absorption.
The slow release.
problem.
Yeah. There's no way you're going to get a good slow release with any oral. I mean, it just, no matter what strategy you use, it's just not going to work. Anything like a suppository delivery like that.
You know, there's more and more. I haven't heard as much negative press about melatonin. The world's been too busy. But since in the last 3 years, I have seen more and more studies like, oh, you know, more and more people are having problems sleeping because we're all going through a shared collective trauma and more stress and all this. And therefore, more people are turning to melatonin, and therefore there's more melatonin injury. I've heard things like that. I don't think most of our viewers are going to go to their primary care MD and say, hey, what do you think of melatonin? Because you're not going to find an allopathic doctor that knows squat about it, quite honestly. So I don't see so much the misinformation. I'm more concerned about misinformation with methylene blue, for example. It's a little foreign to most people. You do a great job explaining it in the book, you know, how it kind of started out as a dye in the 1870s. And
this is a different book, though. It's there's an ebook that I wrote on methylene blue called The Magic Bullet, which we can link to that for your listeners.
Yeah, we will. And I think that's where you were talking about kind of through time, you know, since the 1800s, how it's been used in the thymus surgery to assist with that. And I like to use my allopathic training kind of against itself sometimes. Like, well, this is interesting. So still to this day, 2022, methylene is kind of a primary choice for things like cyanide and carbon monoxide, et cetera. So that shows like Western medicine recognizes its safety and efficacy for the electron transport chain in dire situations, life or death. Carbon monoxide will kill you quickly. Cyanide will kill you quickly.
Yeah.
And yet methylene blue can actually intervene. The fact there's an intervention is amazing, but it's still safe. And it's way underreported, way underutilized. And like you said, and when we get into this, the 10% output, you need to desperately increase the mitochondria, which ironically, right, the symbiotically evolved from a bacteria. So we were anaerobes really until a bacteria helped us become more aerobic.
Yeah.
I want to know kind of everything about methylene blue as well. But before we shift from melatonin to methylene blue, I wanted to talk about melatonin specifically in the role of heavy metal detox, because we're seeing more and more and more of that come up. I don't know if it's just post-industrial revolution. I don't know if we're living longer, so we're seeing more toxic people earlier. But I'm really fascinated with that specific role and function and melatonin's ability to assist in actual detox pathway.
Yeah, it's triggering heavy metal detox from the brain and probably from the rest of the body as well. And the best way I could describe that is if you didn't have energy and all of a sudden you had energy, it's likely that when that energy returned, you're going to be looking around and wanting to organize things or clean things up, right? Because it's kind of part of it's our nature when we don't have energy that we let things slide a little bit, you know, and the important things are attended to, but some of the less important things like housekeeping and cleaning kind of get looked over. And so when you start to charge up that cellular energy, you start to kick out these heavy metals. And so that's why I think it may be a good idea to take binders for anybody when they're starting taking melatonin, especially the higher doses that we're suggesting are safe with people over the age of 40.
Yeah, that's amazing to me. That I call what you're talking about the tip of the spear. If in a perfect operating, ideal physiologic state, we've got a really sharp spear, and it is really good at finding every last, a Borrelia, every last Lyme, every last CMV virus, EBV virus, the COVID virus. But you dull the tip of that spear just a little bit with environmental toxins, like you said, chronic fatigue. You made a really good point in one of your podcasts. There's so many, I can't even keep them straight in my mind, but you were talking about chronic sleep deprivation and how critical sleep is and how critical that role of melatonin is, especially while we're asleep in the inflammatory process and all of that. You sharpen the spear, you restore that tip so that you get rid of things like chronic Lyme, you get rid of neurologic diseases, which may not even be appropriately diagnosed, quite frankly, or they meet, like fibromyalgia, they might be a little bit more trash canny. You can have all kinds of brain lesions that meet the criteria for MS. You remove a heavy metal, guess what? MS goes into remission, dementia's reversed. These are things that are incompatible with our Western understanding, which clearly shows it's wrong. It needs updated. It needs to understand the bigger picture.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that when people start to realize that, they can start looking around at their life, at what are inflammatory triggers, and start looking at removing those. So if people are listening to this and they have a disease that they're dealing with, or they're just looking to be more vital and have better cognitive function, there's really nothing better for the brain and the neurology than working with things like methylene blue and melatonin to improve brain function and also protect your brain. Some of the neuroprotective aspects of both melatonin and methylene blue are incredibly impressive. That some of the laboratory studies they've done with animal models, prior to stroke or a heart attack, for both molecules is just incredible. So having these things on board gives me a feeling of relaxation, knowing that, I've got some protection from some things like that.
Well, I wanted to get into the pineal gland and DMT. We usually go down the rabbit hole with stuff like that. But I think, for time and today, I want to focus on methylene blue because it's something I know less about. I know you do an IV and liposomal, and there are some other different forms. I'm kind of interested in how the laser or the photons that you're talking about concurrently work with methylene blue to activate it, to facilitate its actions at that cellular level. Yeah, I don't understand that.
Yeah, well, methylene blue is it's a salt. It's an industrial salt. It was used originally as a dye because it's a great dye. And in fact, once you start using it, you got some stains.
It's still used, right? For fixing slides.
Oh yeah, for sure. And when you start using it as a supplement, you'll start to realize that, it can stain your fingers and fingernails and your, like my chopping board at home, because we have a product we launched that are these little bars, and you can cut them, into little pieces. And we also, some people take some of the methylene blue suppositories, and they'll cut those as well. And so some of those little pieces can get you in trouble. So you got to have to be careful when you start using methylene blue as a supplement. But basically, what they discovered with methylene blue was pretty fascinating, that it goes right into the mitochondria. It has this affinity to just go right into the mitochondria. And so it accumulates in the mitochondria. So any tissues that are higher metabolically demanding tissues that require more mitochondria, because like example, there's cells in your brain that have as much as 2 million mitochondria, where like the average heart cell has like 4,000 to 5,000, right? But there's some cells that just have a few hundred. So these cells that are more rich with mitochondria are going to show up really, really blue, right? And so people that are doing dissections can soak these tissue samples with methylene blue. And so they were doing a study in the 1800s to try and figure out a cure for malaria, right? And so in order for them to see the organism that they're trying to treat with whatever chemical and the reaction, because they can watch it die and do whatever it's going to do, it starts to quiver and they can see it kind of roll over or whatever. So they put the dye in, and then they found that the parasite that was carrying the malaria literally died from the methylene blue. And so
which was a great moment in history, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Future clinical use and allopathic use, or osteopathic use of methylene. That was amazing discovery. Think about it.
Right. Well, what was really fascinating was that, they further found that it really doesn't have any harm to the tissues. As long as you don't go really, really high with the dosage, you can cause a problem with your ability to make energy, because it kind of basically clogs up the system and doesn't allow the oxygen to get in. But because methylene blue actually charges up the mitochondria independent of oxygen. And so the methylene blue acts as both an electron donor and also an electron acceptor. So a pro-oxidant and an antioxidant. And because of that, you can have about a 30% increase in mitochondrial output, which is a lot. Now you can
especially
further
if you're operating at 10%, right? If you're in the 10% mode and you add 30%, you're going to see healing quick.
Well, that's where the magic of combining methylene blue and melatonin together, because if you're talking about that 10% and that Warburg effect, I'm not sure that the methylene blue has an effect on the Warburg effect like the melatonin does, because I don't know that it's been studied that way. But if you take the melatonin and you return the energy back into the mitochondria and then charge the mitochondria back up, I mean, you're talking futuristic next level. And we treat a lot of patients, Mark. I mean, we have a lot of patients that come into our center here in Sarasota, and we have a healing center, and we focus on a lot of regenerative medicine and orthopedic medicine, but we also do a lot with neurology and a lot of chronic infection and biotoxin illness. And we also do a lot of distance coaching with clients all over the world, really. And having tools like these has been the biggest game changer ever. It makes my job fairly easy, because often, these are kind of some of our first line, along with sinus hygiene, by the way. I know we may not really have time to get into it, but doing some antimicrobial nasal and sinus hygiene really can play a big role into brain health as well. But, with those three things intact, they're kind of make up a big core of our effort with like home care.
Yeah, if I can con you into a part two of that, we'll talk about that, because you also do sinus manipulation, which affects the pineal gland, and there's a lot. I've always been fascinated with the sinuses. I've always had problems with my sinuses. That is why I sound the way that I sound. Nobody hates it more than me. But ultimately, my sinuses most likely got messed up from the exposure to mercury at a young age, which was implanted, of course, by a dentist. Still to this day, we implant this. We're the only first world country that still does, despite its known toxicity. Then you take something like methylene blue, which Western medicine would not disagree with anything that you said about methylene blue. Western medicine actually knows this and yet still doesn't utilize it. It was one of the earlier things that made me kind of abandon all hope. I mean, I knew in medical school, okay, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Like they're going to give me a bunch of information and you put it in your toolbox. This isn't CMEs we're talking about. This is revolutionizing medicine and understanding the way Mother Nature has evolved and designed. Kind of like your H. pylori, acid is there for a reason. You need to understand that it's not a dysfunction of the body. It's that adaptation, like you were talking about. And the adaptation is the innate wisdom of Mother Nature and our body and the power. So your entire philosophy, your entire approach of approaching people on that inflammatory cellular level is, I think, why it is easy. I know it isn't easy for you, but I hear your message loud and clear, because you deal with some really difficult cases. Yeah, you do a lot of high performance people, ultimate fighters and things like that, which, you know, is equally as good. It's just usually we see train wrecks that have given up. You know, it's taken them going round and round and round the system to finally get unbrainwashed and think outside the box. And people put a lot of trust and faith in you because of your knowledge base, your story, your results, and it does come from things like melatonin and methylene blue. We got a few more minutes if you do. Tell me about the photon and the light, the laser how does that activate methylene blue?
Well, so methylene blue is brilliantly blue, and so it absorbs all red and it deflects blue, and that's why it looks blue. And so when the photons in the range of 660 nanometers, which penetrate the body fairly well, when those enter into the mitochondria, those photons act as electrons as well, and they further perpetuate this effect with enhancing cellular energy. So combining those two together is a great idea, and there's a couple of options people have. One of them is to get these red light panels, which we actually sell them. They're called Mitolights on our site, mitozen.com. And secondly is there's these red lights that Sauna Space makes that are really beautiful. And it's something kind of new that I've been playing around with, where I just set the light in the house, you know, and so when I wake up in the morning, I turn it on, and I'm just getting this exposure, you know, to this red light. And you can use it in a sauna scenario, but you can just let it rip in your room. And like, you know, so when I wake up, I have this red light going for 20-30 minutes, and then at night, you know, right around sunset, I turn it on again. And so I'm getting that kind of amber light into my eyes. I'm getting those photons into my skin. And so I'm kind of checking all the boxes, and it's really not that difficult. It's very easy to implement for anybody in their life.
And you also have, what is the device that it looks like a sauna at your office that you walk in that has the red light?
Well, it's like a little room where we have, I think, about 8 of the flat LED panels that produce both infrared and red light.
So it's like a much more intense kind of, you know, commercial grade than people would use in a single light box at home.
Yeah.
Well, it's an honor and a privilege to have you. I'm grateful, appreciative of your time. I know how we've struggled to coordinate our schedule, so I'm super excited it worked out. And I appreciate you taking time and educating our viewers on this. And I do encourage everyone to go out, get this book. It's the audio book. I'm an old-fashioned paper book, and I use it kind of like, it's basically kind of written like a textbook. But Melatonin Miracle Molecule Beyond Sleep is a wealth of information. I couldn't wholeheartedly agree with everything in there. So
awesome. Thank you,
Dr. John Lieurance.
If anybody's interested in more information about the clinic, we're at advancedrejuvenation.us, and then mitozen.com is our store, and then Instagram at Dr. Mitozen at Instagram. And
ultimatecellularreset.com.
Yeah.
As well. So Thank you so much for being
here,
Dr. John. Great. And I hope we can do this again.
All right, let's do it. Thanks, Mark.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right.